So Craig, how did Christian faith become a part of your life?
I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I actually didn't know a whole lot about Christianity. Obviously, I'd heard about Jesus, but I made fun of Christians. I didn't think Christians were very smart because like 80% of the people in my country back then claimed to be Christians, and yet you couldn't tell by how they lived that they took it seriously. And that wasn't true of all of them, but I kind of blended everybody together. And yet I needed to realize that the Christian faith doesn't rise or fall on people who nominally claim to be his followers. It rises or falls on Jesus and whether he rose from the dead. And one day some people brought me the message about Jesus. The way that they brought it was not perhaps the best way. I hit them with what I thought was an unanswerable question. I said, if there's a God, where did the dinosaur bones come from? To which they responded, the devil put them there. So they weren't experts in paleontology. They weren't really quite experts in the Bible, but they did tell me how Jesus died and rose again. And, you know, even though I didn't believe what they were saying about the dinosaurs, I didn't want to stake eternity on them being wrong on everything. And, you know, I'd studied different religions, lots of different philosophies, but as I walked home after talking with them, this was something different, something I'd never experienced before. The presence of God was so strong there that there was no way that I could ignore it. The presence of God that came to me through that message, I had to respond to it one way or the other. And finally, after struggling with this for 45 minutes or so, I said, all right, God, I'll believe in you. And I don't understand what Jesus dying or rising from the dead has to do with putting me right with you, but I know I'm not right with you now. And so if you want to put me right with you, you're going to have to do it yourself. And this is not what happens to everybody, but it's what happened to me. I felt something rushing through my body like I'd never felt before. And I jumped up really scared, and I said, okay, I don't know much else about Christianity yet, but I know God is real, and I always said, if there actually was a God, I would give God everything.
It's interesting because your life is a combination of significant academic research and work, yet your faith is also influenced by an emotional experience. How do you deal with those two differing ways of approaching faith?
I wished that they had given me some more solid answers at the beginning. I had to go hunt for the answers myself afterwards. And that did require some adjustments in what, you know, the church that I joined taught me eventually. But the more I've learned, the more solid it's made me in my faith in Christ. Especially my work is in ancient historical research. I wanted to do, before I met Jesus, I wanted to be an astrophysicist because, you know, that's one way you can look for truth in the world. But when I found out that you know, God had given us the Bible, I said, okay, well, I really want to look for truth there. And so I began to mine that. But especially as I look at ancient historical sources and the way that they were written and so on, it's increased my confidence so much more intellectually, academically, in what I find in terms of Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection. These are foundations for our faith.
In the Greco-Roman world, in that time that Jesus lived, what was the Roman Empire like?
What the Roman Empire was like actually varied from one place to another. If you were in Rome, you would get a free dole of grain every month. But that grain was taken from impoverished peasants who worked the land in Egypt. And the ancient business documents from Egypt suggest that perhaps half of all infants born never made it to adulthood, dying of malnutrition, preventable diseases, and so forth. And part of that was due to the oppressive economic system of the Roman Empire. Now, some places profited from that system, some places suffered more from that system, so it was prejudicial. Even in Rome, most of the people lived in tenement apartments that were very small. The higher up you went, the flimsier they were, the more likely they were to collapse. And at the top, people would be living in a single room with just enough room to lie down for bed. So some people had it really good in the Roman Empire. Those are usually the ones we read about. But the average person struggled a lot.
People who read the Bible or people who are part of church talk about Jesus of Nazareth, which makes Nazareth sound quite significant. In the Roman Empire, where did Nazareth sit?
Probably nobody outside of Galilee really heard of Nazareth until they heard of Jesus from Nazareth. Maybe some people in Judea heard of it, but through most of the Roman Empire, Nazareth was just politically insignificant. But it turned out to be spiritually significant, which can be an encouragement for us that sometimes God is found in the least expected places.
Yeah. Out of Nazareth comes someone, Jesus, who calls himself a Messiah. What did that term mean?
Different Jewish groups had different understandings of what the Messiah was. The term literally means anointed one, which made no sense to Greeks or Romans, but it was a Jewish understanding of the anointed king, the descendant of David. And most Jewish people expected that because he was going to be the ultimate king, the ultimate ruler, that he was going to crush the Roman oppressors, deliver God's people, and exalt them over the nations. Jesus did come to be a king of sorts, but not the kind of king or the kind of kingdom that his people were expecting, at least not the first time. He spoke of the kingdom as like a seed. Someday it'll be a mighty tree, so to speak, but it first comes as a seed. It comes in an insignificant way as far as the world's categories. The New Testament often talks about God's power made perfect in weakness, and the ultimate example of that is in the cross, where Jesus doesn't overthrow Rome, but he lets himself be killed by the Roman imperial power, trusting his Father to raise him from the dead.
People now know the cross as like a symbol. They see it around people's necks and on tops of churches. What was the cross first used by? When the Romans used the cross, why did they use the cross?
The cross was meant to be a humiliating tool of execution. So you would kill people by slow torture, and you would strip them naked so they'd be there in front of everybody. If they needed to relieve themselves of wastes, it would just be in front of everybody, especially further to the east, like in Judea and Syria. Nakedness was considered very shameful. So it was meant to deter people from being revolutionaries. It was meant to execute people who were low-class provincials, and especially those who, as the Roman governor's decree put it, claimed to be a king or claimed to, in other ways, have treason against the Roman Empire, against the emperor.
So it was a symbol of humiliation and torture.
Yes.
And intriguing, isn't it, that this Messiah figure ends up there? So why the cross?
Partly, I think, to show us that God's power is made perfect in weakness. You know, the miracles are wonderful. The Bible portrays miracles as a foretaste of the future kingdom, future glory. But the cross reminds us that even where things look their darkest, even where things look impossible, the greatest travesty of injustice, God is still at work to bring about his purposes.
You said before, you were telling us that you struggled in belief. One of the things you must have struggled with was the resurrection. How do you deal with that now?
I didn't actually struggle with the resurrection too much. What I struggled with was whether there was a God. Once there was a God, resurrection's no problem.
And why is the resurrection, this sounds like a silly question, but why is the resurrection important?
The resurrection is the cornerstone of our faith. I mean, if Jesus simply was executed for high treason against the majesty of the emperor, for claiming to be king, then, well, he's like a lot of other people who were crucified for that. He had some great teachings about, being nice to people, loving everyone. But if he rose from the dead, then God the Father vindicated him, and Jesus is still alive. And the witness of those who knew him is true. Jesus is alive. He's also Lord of the universe and reigns, and we owe him our lives.